before Pablo Escobar became the most wanted man alive. Another Colombian was already flooding America with cocaine, not in suitcases or fishing boats, but through a fleet of aircraft and an entire Bahamian island he had purchased and converted into a private transshipment hub. His name was Carlos Lehder. A declassified United States intelligence memo would later label him the true industrializer of the cocaine trade. But the blueprint that permanently reshaped global narcotics trafficking was not born in the jungles of Colombia. It was conceived inside an American prison cell. Carlos Enrique Lehder Rivas was born on December 7, 1949, in Armenia, Colombia, a town nestled in the heart of the country's coffee region. His father, Wilhelm Lehder, had come from Germany after the Second World War, bringing with him the discipline of a civil engineer and the memories of a continent in ruins. His mother, Helena Rivas, taught at the local primary school, instilling a love of learning and a sense of Colombian identity. The family's modest house on Calle Sur reflected their middle-class standing, comfortable but never extravagant. Baptismal records from the Parroquia San Jose confirm the family's Catholic roots, while municipal tax rolls from the 1950s show steady, if unremarkable, property ownership. That stability unraveled in 1962 when Wilhelm's engineering contract ended. At just 13, Carlos boarded a plane with his parents, bound for Queens, New York. Passenger arrival records at the National Archives list him as Carlos Lehder, age 13, German Colombian, arriving with his parents. The sudden shift from the quiet streets of Armenia to the crowded neighborhoods of Queens was jarring. English became a second language learned out of necessity, while German and Spanish remained spoken at home. School district files from Francis Lewis High School reveal a boy who struggled to adapt. Attendance was spotty, disciplinary notes mention truancy and fights, and the transcript is dotted with incomplete courses. Yet the move to New York also brought new skills. Carlos picked up American slang alongside his classroom English. He learned to navigate the city's patchwork of immigrant communities, blending in with Italian, Irish, and Jewish classmates. After school, he worked as an assistant at a Brooklyn auto garage owned by a fellow German immigrant. The garage job, confirmed by a 1968 business license, gave him a practical education in mechanics, an understanding of engines, locks, and the value of mobility. These early experiences, straddling two cultures, learning to adapt, and acquiring technical know-how, would later shape the way he moved between worlds, both legal and illegal. What began as a childhood defined by migration and adjustment would set the stage for a life spent crossing borders, both literal and moral. In the summer of 1969, a stolen Chevrolet turned up at the Brooklyn waterfront, its serial numbers filed off, its papers forged. The arrest log from NYPD 67th Precinct lists Carlos Lehder among the suspects picked up that night. At 19, he was already running with a crew that specialized in moving hot cars from New York docks to South America. The operation was simple but efficient. Cars disappeared from city streets, were stashed in garages, like the one where Lehder worked, then loaded into shipping containers bound for Colombia. His older brother Lucho handled the sales on the Medellín end, greasing palms and arranging for the vehicles to vanish into the black market. Police reports from the time describe a network that stretched from Queens to Cartagena, with Lehder as a trusted middleman, fluent in English, German, and Spanish, and always looking for the next angle. By 1971, the game caught up with him. Court documents from Queens County list Lehder's conviction for grand larceny auto. The sentencing transcript notes his knack for high-risk deals and a growing disregard for authority. 18 months in the Queens County Jail followed. He was assigned inmate number 00173-002. Inside, Lehder found more than punishment. He found opportunity. The The jail was a crossroads for hustlers, smugglers, and would-be kingpins. One cellmate, John Jelly McNeil, ran a drug smuggling crew with ties to Miami and the Caribbean. Conversations behind bars turned to logistics, how to move contraband, how to avoid customs, how to build trust in a world where betrayal was currency. Lehder listened, learned, and started to sketch out a bigger vision. The car theft ring had taught him about international shipping, false paperwork, and the value of reliable networks. Now, surrounded by men who saw the drug trade as the real prize, he began to imagine how those same skills could be scaled up. The prison walls did not confine his ambition. Instead, they sharpened it, setting him on a path where stolen Chevrolets were just the beginning. Locked behind bars in Queens County Jail, Carlos Lehder's mind never slowed. He filled the margins of prison stationery with diagrams and lists, mapping out routes and contacts as if he were already free. The car theft network that once moved Chevrolets from Brooklyn to Cartagena became a template for something far bigger. In his cell, Lehder began to correspond with inmates who knew the Miami drug scene, men like John Jelly McNeil, who could recite the weak points of U.S. Customs, and Ray Miller, an American pilot with a knack for flying under the radar. Their letters, some now preserved in Bureau of Prisons archives, read like operational briefings, notes on aircraft specifications, airstrip coordinates, and the going rates for pilots willing to risk a run from the Caribbean to Florida. Lehder's curiosity about aviation grew into an obsession. By 1974, after his release, he enrolled in pilot lessons at Keeneland Flight School, a small operation outside Miami. Flight school files from that year show his name on the roster for single-engine certification. He learned how to file false flight plans, how to fly low to avoid radar, and how to land on rough strips that most pilots would never attempt. The mechanics he had picked up in Brooklyn now had a new purpose. Every bolt and wire mattered when a Cessna was loaded with illegal cargo. Inside prison, Lehder's network expanded. He traded favors for introductions, using his bilingual skills to connect Colombian suppliers with American distributors. Letters moved through the mailroom, coded in slang and inside jokes, but the intent was clear: build a pipeline that bypassed the old risky routes. The idea was simple but radical: turn cocaine smuggling into a repeatable, industrial process with standardized flights, trusted pilots, and a secure fixed base somewhere beyond the reach of law enforcement. A declassified memo from 1974 found in federal archives describes Lehder as a planner, methodical, disciplined, and always recruiting. By the time his sentence ended, the blueprint was complete. He had the contacts, the skills, and a vision. An air bridge for cocaine run with the precision of a factory. All he needed now was the right patch of land to put his plan into action. In the late 1970s, a quiet transformation began on a speck of land in the Exumas. Norman's Cay, once a sleepy outpost for fishermen and weekend sailors, started to change hands in ways that few locals could track. Registry filings from 1976 show the first hints of something unusual. A Bahamian company called Norman's Cay Enterprises Limited appeared as the official owner, but the paperwork led only to a post office box in Nassau. Behind that shell, two offshore holding companies, Caribe Holdings and Pacific Island Holdings, were quietly incorporated in Panama and the British Virgin Islands. These entities received a steady stream of wire transfers traced back to Medellín, Colombia, each routed through banks in Miami and Zurich, then funneled into the Bahamian accounts. The property records reveal a careful strategy. Lehder began with a minority stake, acquiring just 30% of the Cay in 1976. Over the next 18 months, small shareholders were pressured to sell. Some received above-market offers. Others reported threats or unexplained vandalism to their boats and homes. By 1978, Norman's Cay Enterprises controlled the entire island, but no public record named Lehder directly. The Bahamian Land Registry at the time required only the name of the local company, not its ultimate owners. Corporate filings document how directors rotated every few months, each a nominee with no real ties to the island. The real decisions came from Medellín, where Lehder's instructions were relayed through trusted intermediaries. Infrastructure contracts for airstrip improvements and fuel storage tanks were signed by the front company, but invoices list suppliers in Florida and Colombia. This paper trail, later reconstructed by U.S. prosecutors, showed a deliberate effort to hide the true beneficiary. Lehder's method was as much about secrecy as about power. By the time local authorities realized the island had changed, every legal lever pointed back to a maze of offshore firms, each layer designed to keep the real owner invisible, and the Cay firmly under cartel control. Night fell early over Norman's Cay, but the real work started long after the last fishing boat left the harbor. By 10 p.m., the island's runway lit up, just enough for the pilots to see, but not enough to catch the attention of U.S. radar. This was the night run, a carefully orchestrated window when American surveillance was thinnest, and the airspace between Colombia and the Bahamas became a hidden corridor for cocaine. On the tarmac, ground crews moved in silence. Twin-engine C-46 commandos, stripped of airline markings, touched down one after another, each carrying up to 3 tons of cocaine in sealed burlap sacks. Flight manifests seized years later listed code names, not pilots, and gave only rough estimates of cargo weight. The unloading process was a blur. Dollies rolled from cargo doors to steel warehouses, where the drugs were weighed, repackaged, and stacked for the next leg north. Lehder's system ran like an assembly line. While one crew refueled the big transports, a second group loaded smaller Cessnas and Pipers for the feeder flights. These planes, chosen for their short takeoff ability, hopped to tiny cays or low-traffic airstrips scattered across the Bahamas. From there, the cargo was hidden in banana crates, stuffed into speedboats, or flown directly to rural Florida. Each leg was timed to exploit radar gaps mapped by Lehder's scouts. FAA logs from the era show regular spikes in unidentified low-altitude traffic over the Exumas, but few leads ever materialized. The dual aircraft system meant no single plane or pilot ever carried a full load the entire distance. If a U.S. Customs plane appeared on the horizon, runway lights snapped off, and every pilot switched to a backup frequency. On a red alert, the big transports dumped fuel and diverted to a backup strip, while feeder aircraft blended in with the island's regular traffic. This was not smuggling by chance. It was a logistics blueprint, repeatable, scalable, and almost impossible to stop. Norman's Cay became a bottleneck through which hundreds of tons of cocaine passed each year, all coordinated from a single radio tower and a handful of ledgers that never listed Lehder's name. The operation's industrial scale set a new standard for the cartel era, turning a remote island into the beating heart of a continent-wide supply chain. Inside cartel circles, logistics and trust were everything. By 1979, Carlos Lehder's system at Norman's Cay had outpaced every rival smuggling route. The Medellín Cartel, led by Pablo Escobar and the Ochoa brothers, formalized a pact that changed the landscape of the cocaine trade. A cartel memorandum, later read in a United States federal court, spelled it out. Lehder held exclusive rights to operate all cartel air routes into the United States. No other member could move cocaine by plane without his direct consent. The agreement wasn't just a handshake. It was enforced with threats, armed guards, and the cartel's internal discipline squad. This exclusive aerial role gave Lehder the power to standardize every flight. Aircraft landed in the Bahamas on a fixed schedule, cargo was logged, and pilots carried badges that marked them as Lehder's men. Former pilot Luis Navia recalled that any unapproved plane risked being shot down. The system ran with the precision of a freight company, but the cargo was measured in tons of cocaine. The impact was immediate and massive. DEA reports from 1979 estimated that United States cocaine consumption had soared to 150 tons that year, a six-fold jump since the start of the decade. Norman's Cay became the single largest funnel for this flood. Every bale that crossed the runway meant millions in profit, not just for Lehder, but for the entire cartel. Escobar's product moved north with factory line regularity, and the cartel's profits exploded. The synergy between Lehder's logistics and Escobar's supply made the Medellín Cartel a global force. United States law enforcement struggled to keep up. Internal DEA memos described Norman's Cay as the primary air bridge for all Colombian cocaine entering North America. The cartel's decision to centralize air transport under Lehder's command turned a scattered trade into a multinational industry, one that would soon be measured not in shipments, but in metric tons and billions of dollars. As the profits surged, so did the stakes. The alliance between Lehder and Escobar would soon draw the attention of governments, rivals, and enemies far beyond Colombia and the Bahamas. Mansions in Medellín, a fleet of private aircraft, armored cars, and a Bahamian island ringed with armed guards made clear that Carlos Lehder's fortune left no room for subtlety. Property ledgers from the late 1970s list luxury homes under shell companies, while aviation records track dozens of planes registered to front corporations in Florida and Panama. On Norman's Cay, the casino and villa became settings for wild parties, but also for something darker. Rallies where Lehder delivered speeches wrapped in Nazi banners, quoting Hitler and railing against the United States. Sworn affidavits from cartel pilots described flags bearing swastikas flying beside the radio tower, and eyewitnesses recall guards sporting armbands with skull insignia. Audio archives from WABC radio capture Lehder's voice promising a new Reich for the Americas, while transcripts from his 1982 campaign for the Colombian Senate show him blending anti-United States rhetoric with open praise for Nazi Germany. The excess and extremism made him notorious, but also toxic. Allies distanced themselves as his ideology grew more public and his paranoia deepened. The wealth that once bought loyalty now bought only isolation, and Lehder's empire began to rot from within. A classified FBI memo dated March 1987 stamped Carlos Lehder as a top priority target. The label was not just for show. His name appeared alongside a handful of global fugitives, and every field office from Miami to Bogota had standing orders to track his movements. Months of wiretaps, satellite surveillance, and paid informants began to close in. In Colombia, the National Police received a U.S. extradition dossier outlining Lehder's role as the architect of Norman's Cay air bridge. The file included flight logs, intercepted radio calls, and statements from former cartel pilots willing to testify. On February 4, 1987, a multinational task force of Colombian police, DEA agents, and U.S. Marshals launched a pre-dawn raid near Medellín. Lehder was found hiding in a farmhouse outside Guarne, surrounded by bodyguards who surrendered without a shot. Within hours, he was flown to Bogota under heavy guard, then handed over to U.S. authorities. The extradition, authorized under the 1979 treaty, made headlines across the Americas. For the first time, one of the cartel's architects would face trial in a U.S. courtroom, and the era of impunity for kingpins like Lehder was drawing to a close. The jury's decision landed with finality. Carlos Lehder received a life sentence plus an additional 135 years, a punishment that signaled the end of his reign but not the end of his influence. The court transcript from U.S. v. Lehder, filed on October 30, 1987, details every count: conspiracy, smuggling, racketeering, each charge stacking years onto a sentence meant to remove him from the world he helped create. Judge Hovler's sentencing memorandum cited not just the mountains of evidence, but the global reach of Lehder's network, emphasizing how Norman's Cay had become a blueprint for industrial-scale trafficking. One of the most unusual moments in the trial came with the introduction of Manuel Noriega's sworn testimony. The former Panamanian leader, himself under investigation, described cash transfers and meetings that tied Lehder's air bridge to broader networks of protection and corruption. Noriega's deposition, partially declassified in 1999, became a rare instance of a foreign head of state testifying against a cartel architect. Prosecutors used it to trace millions in cartel funds through Panamanian banks, reinforcing the case that Lehder's operation was not just vast, but deeply embedded in the machinery of international crime. After the verdict, law enforcement agencies pored over, seized documents and flight logs from Norman's Cay. Within months, reports from the DEA and academic studies began to circulate, analyzing how Lehder's methods, fixed air corridors, compartmentalized crews, and offshore corporate shells had spread beyond the Bahamas. The Lehder model became shorthand for a system that others would try to copy, from Mexico's Sinaloa network to Caribbean smuggling rings. Even as Lehder disappeared behind prison walls, his innovations continued to shape the drug trade, proving that the consequences of his blueprint would outlast the man himself. Today, the global cocaine trade still runs on the industrial blueprint Lehder designed. With air corridors, offshore hubs, and ruthless logistics. As traffickers adapt and profits soar, governments fight a battle he helped define. The methods outlast the man. Every shipment that moves unseen is a reminder. What one architect builds, entire worlds inherit. Share your thoughts below. How do you think this legacy shapes our world today?